Starting with number 1, Renault FT France, 1917, carried into World War II. The Renault FT was revolutionary when it first appeared in the First World War, but by 1939, it was a relic. France still deployed over 1,000 of them when Germany invaded, not out of confidence, but out of desperation. The tank's top speed barely reached 8 kilometers per hour. Its armor, never thick to begin with, offered almost no resistance to modern anti-tank weapons. German crews reported destroying them with standard rifle caliber fire at close range. French tankers who climbed inside understood they were sitting in a machine designed for a war that had ended 2 decades earlier. When the Wehrmacht swept through France in May 1940, Renault FTs were abandoned by the hundreds, not because their crews fled, but because the tanks simply could not keep pace with the battlefield. They were bypassed, outmaneuvered, and left behind. Their presence on the front line was not a contribution to French defense. It was a measure of how unprepared France truly was. 2. Panzer I Germany, 1934. Germany built the Panzer I as a training vehicle, a platform to teach crews the mechanics of armored warfare, while the country quietly rearmed in violation of Versailles. The problem was that when war came faster than expected, it was pushed into frontline combat with nothing more than 2 7.92mm machine guns and armor that topped out at 13mm. In Spain during the Civil War, Soviet-supplied T-20s tore through Panzer IS with ease. In Poland and France, it fared marginally better only because of how German commanders used concentrated armor doctrine to avoid direct confrontation. But in North Africa and on the Eastern Front, it was defenseless. Crews reported that enemy infantry armed with anti-tank rifles could penetrate the hull. The mechanical unreliability compounded everything. The engine overheated in desert conditions, the suspension broke down regularly on rough terrain, and the 2-man crew was stretched beyond what the design could reasonably support. The Panzer I was a placeholder that overstayed its welcome by several years of brutal combat. Number 3, Carro Armato L3, 35, Italy, 1935. Italy entered the Second World War with a tank force built around a philosophy of lightness and economy that bore no relationship to the realities of modern armored combat. The L3-35 was the centerpiece of that philosophy, a tankette barely larger than a civilian automobile, weighing just 3.5 tons and carrying 2 machine guns as its sole armament. In Ethiopia, it had crushed lightly armed resistance. But when Italian forces deployed it across North Africa and Greece, the results were catastrophic. British Matilda tanks and even wheeled armored cars were effectively immune to its weapons. The L3-35 could not penetrate their armor at any practical combat range. Meanwhile, its own 8mm of protection offered almost nothing in return. In Greece, Italian commanders watched entire formations of L3-35s become immobilized on mountain roads they were never engineered to climb. Crews who survived described the psychological burden of driving into battle knowing their vehicle could not harm most enemies and could be destroyed by weapons far less sophisticated than dedicated anti-tank guns. The L3-35 was not simply inadequate. It was a strategic liability that told the story of Italy's industrial and doctrinal limitations before the war had properly begun. 4. Type 94 tankette, Japan, 1935. Japan's military culture in the 1930s prized aggression, discipline, and spiritual fortitude over material strength. That philosophy shaped its armor procurement in ways that proved fatal to the men inside. The Type 94 was a 2-man tankette developed primarily for infantry support and colonial policing operations in Manchuria and China, where opposition was lightly equipped. At 6mm of armor and armed with a single machine gun, it was never designed to fight other armored vehicles. Japanese commanders understood this, but deployed it anyway in the Pacific Theater because nothing better was available in sufficient quantities. On Luzon, on Guadalcanal, on Bataan, American infantry with bazookas and even .50 caliber heavy machine guns found they could disable or destroy Type 94s with relative ease. Japanese tank crews fought with genuine courage inside machines that gave them almost no survivable margin. Penetrating hits frequently ignited the fuel supply, and the cramped interior offered no path to rapid escape. Casualty rates among Type 94 crews in sustained combat were severe. The tank reflected a military establishment that had prioritized naval and air power, while leaving its ground armor doctrine dangerously underdeveloped against any peer-level opposition. 5. Vickers A1E1 Independent, United Kingdom, 1926, fielded into early war service. Britain's Independent was a remarkable engineering achievement that arrived at completely the wrong moment, and then spent the following decade poisoning British armor doctrine. Its multi-turret configuration, a central 47mm main gun surrounded by 4 subsidiary machine gun turrets, influenced tank designers across Europe and in the Soviet Union, where the concept was enthusiastically expanded into the disastrous T-35. The Independent itself was never produced beyond a single prototype, but its legacy cascaded outward. British armored doctrine in the 1930s bifurcated dangerously between infantry tanks and cruiser tanks, leaving a conceptual gap that produced vehicles optimized for narrow roles and poorly suited for the combined arms fighting that Germany had already begun to master. Crews who trained in British armored formations during the early war period found themselves in vehicles shaped by this legacy. Too slow, too specialized, or too thinly armored for the engagements they were thrust into. The Independent never fought in combat, but the thinking it represented contributed to battlefield defeats that cost thousands of lives before British armor doctrine was painfully reformed. 6. T-35, Soviet Union, 1933. The T-35 was the Soviet Union's most visible armored symbol of industrial ambition in the 1930s, a land battleship stretching nearly 10 meters, carrying 5 turrets, a 76mm main gun, 2 45mm secondary guns, and 6 machine guns, manned by a crew of 11. On parade through Red Square, it was enormous and imposing. In combat, it was a catastrophe. The tank's mechanical systems were extraordinarily fragile. The transmission broke down constantly. The engine struggled to move 45 tons of steel across anything other than flat, firm ground. During Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1941, German forces advancing through Ukraine and Belarusia encountered T-35s abandoned by the roadside, not destroyed by enemy fire, but simply broken down and left behind because Soviet crews had no means to repair them in the field. Of the roughly 60 T-35s that entered combat in 1941, only a handful were actually destroyed by German weapons. The rest were lost to mechanical failure, fuel starvation, or ditching in terrain the suspension could not manage. The T-35 consumed enormous industrial resources, required a massive crew, and contributed almost nothing to Soviet defensive efforts during the most critical weeks of the entire war. 7. Churchill Mki, United Kingdom, 1941. The Churchill tank had a troubled early life that its later variants would eventually overcome, but the original Mki deployed to North Africa and to the disastrous Dieppe raid of August 1942 was a very different story. The Mki mounted a 2-pounder gun in its main turret, already marginal against contemporary German armor, and a 3-inch howitzer in the hull, a configuration that reflected confused British thinking about what a tank was actually supposed to do in battle. The hull-mounted howitzer was nearly useless in the field. The 2-pounder was outranged and outpenetrated by German anti-tank guns, and the tank's mechanical reliability during its early service was genuinely poor. At Dieppe, 29 Churchills were landed in support of the Canadian assault force. None made it off the beach. Some became stuck in the shingle. Others were disabled almost immediately by German defensive fire. The tank crews who survived the landing did so largely without armored support, and the raid itself became one of the most costly Allied operations of the war, with over 3,000 Canadian casualties in under 10 hours. The Churchill's later marks were substantially improved, but the Mki's operational debut left a legacy of distrust that British commanders were slow to overcome. 8. M3 Lee, United States, 1941. The M3 Lee was not a bad tank by the standards of what American industry could produce quickly in 1941, and that qualification carries the full weight of its tragedy. With its 75mm main gun mounted in a sponson on the hull rather than a rotating turret, the tank could not traverse its primary weapon without turning the entire vehicle, a crippling limitation in mobile armored combat. The silhouette was dramatically tall, presenting an oversized target to enemy gunners. The riveted hull, standard American construction practice at the time, had a dangerous tendency to produce lethal secondary fragmentation inside the crew compartment when struck, as rivets sheared off and became projectiles. British crews in North Africa named it the Coffin for Six Brothers, an epithet that captured the combination of height, poor traverse, and interior fragmentation risk with grim accuracy. American tankers were not enthusiastic either. In the confused fighting around Kasserine Pass in February 1943, M3s were outclassed by German Panzer IVs in nearly every engagement. The Lee was always understood to be a stopgap, a tank built to give Allied forces something to fight with while the M4 Sherman entered mass production. But the men who fought in it during that transitional period bore the full cost of that compromise. Number 9. Semovan M13-40, Italy, 1940. Italy's M13-40 represented a genuine attempt to field a medium tank capable of competing with contemporary designs, and in the North African theater, it briefly succeeded against lighter British opposition in 1940 and early 1941. The tank carried a 47mm gun capable of penetrating most British armor at reasonable combat distances, and its initial performance gave Italian commanders cautious optimism. But the M13-40 was undone by a series of compounding failures that became impossible to ignore as the war progressed. The engine was chronically unreliable, and desert conditions accelerated the mechanical deterioration. Fuel consumption was excessive, and Italian supply lines across the Mediterranean were under sustained British naval and air attack, meaning fuel shortages became a battlefield reality. The armor protection, adequate against early British tanks, was entirely insufficient against the Crusader, Matilda, and later Valentine designs. Most critically, the tank carried no radio as standard equipment in its early production runs, forcing Italian commanders to communicate between vehicles using flag signals in the middle of combat, a method entirely unsuited to the speed and confusion of armored engagements. Italian crews fought with determination, but inside a vehicle that denied them the situational awareness that every armored engagement demanded. 10. Panzerkampfwagen 35T, Germany, 1935. When Germany absorbed Czechoslovakia in 1939, the Wehrmacht inherited the Czech Army's armored inventory, including the LT VZ-35, redesignated the Panzer 35T. It was, in the mid-1930s, a genuinely competitive design, well-armed, reasonably armored, and mechanically sound by the standards of its time. By 1941, it was none of those things. The pneumatic servo systems that controlled its transmission and braking were sophisticated, but deeply vulnerable to cold weather. And when German forces pushed into the Soviet Union in the winter of 1941, the systems froze. Crews found themselves unable to shift gears or apply brakes reliably in temperatures that dropped to -30 and below. German mechanics lacked the specialized knowledge to repair the Czech systems quickly, and spare parts were increasingly difficult to source as Czech production capacity was redirected. The 37mm gun, adequate against Polish and French opposition, was nearly useless against the Soviet T-34 and KV-1. Panzer 35T units on the Eastern Front suffered disproportionate losses, not always to enemy fire, but to the accumulated weight of mechanical failures in conditions the tank was never built to survive. It was a capable machine that had simply aged past its operational utility, while the war around it accelerated beyond all original expectations. 11. Valentine MKI, United Kingdom, 1940. The Valentine was designed by Vickers as a private venture, built conservatively to ensure reliability, and it did achieve a degree of mechanical dependability that many British tanks of the period lacked. What it did not achieve was combat effectiveness. The original MKI carried the same 2-pounder gun that equipped most British tanks in the early war, a weapon that could defeat German Panzer IIIs at close range in 1941, but became progressively inadequate as German armor was upgunned and up-armored throughout the war. The turret was designed for a 2-man crew, meaning the commander was also required to load and fire the main gun, a workload that degraded situational awareness and response time in combat. British armored commanders repeatedly flagged this as a critical operational deficiency. In North Africa, Valentine crews engaging Panzer IVs at standard combat ranges found their gun could not reliably penetrate the enemy's frontal armor while remaining well within the kill range of the German 75mm. The Valentine was improved across 13 distinct marks, eventually receiving a 6-pounder and later a 75mm gun. But the early production vehicles that carried the brunt of the desert fighting represented a tank that arrived in battle already behind the curve it would spend years trying to catch. Number 12. Char B1, France, 1936. The Char B1 was, by the numbers, one of the most powerful tanks in the world when France and Germany went to war in May 1940. Its 47mm turret gun and hull-mounted 75mm howitzer gave it firepower that most German tanks of the period could not match. Its armor was thick enough to deflect virtually everything the Panzer III and Panzer IV could fire at standard combat ranges. German tank crews who encountered them reported genuine alarm. And yet the Char B1 was routed, abandoned, and captured in enormous numbers during the fall of France, because the tank's design embodied every operational failure that plagued French armor doctrine. The hull-mounted 75mm could only traverse by rotating the entire tank using a precision steering system that broke down frequently and demanded exceptional driver skill under combat stress. Fuel consumption was extreme. The tank's operational range was barely 180 kilometers, and the French logistics system could not keep pace with fuel deliveries during the rapid German advance. The Char B1 required dedicated resupply far more frequently than its operational tempo allowed. The crews who survived the campaign described sitting in technically superior machines, waiting for fuel that never arrived. As German infantry closed in around them, superiority on paper meant nothing when doctrine, logistics, and command had already failed. 13. M4 Sherman, United States, 1942. The M4 Sherman became the backbone of Allied armored forces across every major theater, and its production numbers, nearly 50,000 built, reflected American industrial capacity at its most formidable. But the early variants that entered combat in North Africa and the Pacific carried a combination of design compromises that got men killed in ways that were entirely foreseeable. The most critical was the ammunition storage arrangement. In early Shermans, propellant charges for the main gun were stored in sponsons along the upper hull sides, unprotected by any wet stowage system. When a penetrating round struck those sponsons, the tank did not simply stop functioning, it erupted. Allied crews called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter brand, whose advertising slogan promised it lit first time, every time. German tankers called it the Tommy Cooker. The names were different, but the meaning was identical. At Villers-Bocage, at the Falaise Gap, and across the hedgerow country of Normandy, burning Shermans became a defining visual of the Western Front. The wet stowage modification introduced in 1944 dramatically reduced fire risk. But the thousands of crews who fought before that upgrade had no such protection. They climbed into a vehicle that, when struck in the wrong place, gave them almost no time to escape. 14 Cruiser Tank Mk IA-9, United Kingdom, 1937. Britain's doctrine of the 1930s divided its tank force into infantry tanks and cruiser tanks, the former built for slow, deliberate assault support and the latter for exploitation and pursuit following a breakthrough. The A-9 cruiser was among the first purpose-built cruiser designs, and it carried every weakness that philosophy produced when pushed into actual combat. Its armor reached a maximum of 14 millimeters. Protection calibrated against small arms and shell splinters, not dedicated anti-tank weapons. Its suspension, a modified Vickers commercial design, was mechanically unreliable at sustained operational speeds, and the cruiser doctrine demanded sustained speed above all else. In North Africa in 1940 and 1941, A-9S deployed with the 7th Armored Division broke down in numbers that degraded effective unit strength before combat was even joined. The 2-pounder main gun was adequate against Italian armor, but offered marginal capability against anything Germany fielded. Crews operating A-9S reported constant anxiety about mechanical failure in the open desert, where a broken-down tank was as dangerous as an enemy round. Stranded crews in temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius with limited water and no recovery vehicle in reach faced a survival situation independent of any battlefield threat. 15 T-60, Soviet Union, 1941. The T-60 was born from catastrophe. In the summer and autumn of 1941, the Soviet Union was losing tanks faster than any factory could replace them, and the decision was made to produce a light tank that could be manufactured quickly, cheaply, and in enormous numbers using automotive industry tooling. The result was a vehicle that filled production quotas while offering frontline crews very little in return. The T-60's 20mm autocannon could not penetrate the frontal armor of any German tank in service, and its own armor of 20mm maximum offered minimal protection against the weapons those German tanks and anti-tank guns carried. Soviet tank crews assigned to T-60s understood their situation with brutal clarity. Reports from armored unit commanders in 1942 described T-60 formations being destroyed at long range before they could close to any distance where their weapons became relevant. The tank's small size made it difficult to observe from inside, and the one-man turret required the commander to aim, load, and fire simultaneously while attempting to maintain awareness of the battlefield around him. It survived in Soviet service because there was nothing immediately available to replace it, and because a tank, even an inadequate one, was judged more useful than no tank at all. 16. Panzer II Germany, 1936. The Panzer II entered service as a stopgap, intended to equip German armored units, while the more capable Panzer III and IV completed development. Like the Panzer I before it, it was pushed into frontline roles it was never designed to fill, and remained in service long after its operational utility had expired. Its 20mm autocannon could engage soft-skinned vehicles and light armor effectively, but against the medium and heavy tanks that increasingly defined the Eastern Front from 1941 onward, it was effectively useless. Its armor of 14mm maximum was penetrated by Soviet anti-tank rifles, weapons designed to defeat light armor, not main battle tanks. German commanders who still had Panzer IIs on their unit rolls in 1942 treated them as reconnaissance assets or used them for internal security duties, because committing them to armored engagements against Soviet T-34s was understood to be a death sentence for the crew. The Panzer II's longevity in German service reflected not confidence in the design, but the chronic inability of German industry to produce sufficient numbers of better vehicles to replace every obsolete tank in the inventory. The crews who found themselves assigned to Panzer IIs on the Eastern Front were aware that the machine around them offered almost nothing between them and the weapons they would face. If you enjoy uncovering the successes and failures that shaped military history, consider subscribing for more. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.